So last week, we talked about the golden rule, to do unto others as you would have them do to you. Treat others the way you would like to be treated. And we talked about how that phrase, which was not unique to Jesus, but actually had been present in the wisdom teachings of almost every single culture upon the planet and almost every religious tradition, was something that Jesus uses in the end of the Sermon on the Mount by Matthew's account to sum up all the things that we had been talking about prior to that. You can sum up all of Jesus' behavioral instruction in that simple phrase. Treat others the way you would like to be treated. And with that phrase, the Sermon on the Mount pivots to the last three paragraphs, the last three examples that Jesus gives that talk to us about what I have come to believe is the imperative of his narrative. And that is that Jesus cares more than anything else about how we live. Not what we think, not what we believe, but how we live our lives, especially with each other. And this text that we have before us is the first of the next and last three that all hone in on that same conviction. What we do with our lives, how we treat one another, is paramount in what it means to be a follower of his. So he starts today warning them about false prophets, false teachers. And it's interesting, one of the things in seminary that we learn, whenever we approach a gospel text in particular, is we learn to keep in mind, as we're trying to interpret the text, three different historical situations. The first one is when and where Jesus might have actually said those words. And that's hard to get at sometimes, because if you read the Gospels closely, you realize that Jesus in one Gospel says it in this situation, and in another Gospel says it in a different situation, and we don't always know exactly which one is the right one, or if either of them is actually what happened or where he was, or whether this is just how that particular Gospel writer remembers it. The second situation we have to keep in mind when we're interpreting the Gospels is the situation of the Gospel writer himself, his community, and what was going on in his community when he wrote that Gospel, because he wrote it in such a way that he wanted to speak a particular emphatic way to that community at that time. And so the narrative of Matthew's Gospel constructs the Sermon on the Mount differently from the way Luke does, who is writing to a different community in a different time. So, for example, Matthew's writing his Gospel in the year in the year 85. Not 1985. In the year 85. So he's 50 years, 55 years after Jesus. And he is constructing this Gospel to speak to situations that were going on in his community. And one of those situations clearly is the issue of other people coming in with a different message. A message that they preach not in an effort to serve the community, but an effort to exploit the community. Preachers who exploit the community. Now we know this happened because 30 years earlier, in 55 AD, Paul writes the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, and he talks about false teachers who are coming in and taking advantage of the community. And he contrasts the way they work with the community to the way he worked when he was in the community, not making any of them dependent upon him while he was there, but inviting them to support him then when he went to another community. So Paul's way of working was the community where he was here, he got missionary support and pledges to help him get to and support him in the next community. And he was a tent maker. He sewed up the sails on ships, and he sewed up other kinds of canvas things. And he helped make his living that way so that he didn't create a burden for the community where he was. But there were other preachers who didn't do that. There were other preachers who came in and they were happy to fleece the flock, as it were. And so Matthew, aware of that reality in his time, pulls into the end of the Sermon on the Mount this admonition that he puts in the words of Jesus, and very well may have been spoken by Jesus in anticipation of what would happen. And he says, beware of preachers, of teachers who come as wolves in sheep's clothing. They will look the part. They might even sound the part, although I don't know how wolves could actually pull that off. But they will not act the part. Because what do sheep like to eat? What do wolves like to eat? Sheep. Absolutely. And so he raises up a standard and says, how are you going to tell them apart? It's not necessarily going to be by their words. It's not going to be necessarily by their doctrine, even. It's going to be by their actions. By their actions. When I first came into the West Side, Juan Rivera, who was a student of Irma Diaz de Leon's when she was a high school teacher, and who had become one of the pastors at Victory Outreach, sat down with me at the invitation of a mutual friend as I was trying to kind of get to know people in the West Side. And Juan Rivera sat across the desk from me, and he looked at me with laser beam eyes. And he said, look, young man, we don't need any more preachers in the West Side who are coming in here to get our girls pregnant and then split.
Wow.
I was like, yes, sir. Didn't know that was a thing. But evidently it was. And not just then, but just this week I read about a well-known pastor in Florida who had been having an intimate relationship with a 14-year-old girl. Wolves in sheep's clothing. But that's not the only way that pastors could take advantage of the flock. At our last presbytery meeting, Carl Spinner got up. He's a public accountant who's worked with lots of churches. And he said, friends, I have some bad news for us as a presbytery. We have an epidemic of embezzlement in this presbytery. In the last couple of years, there have been 8 or 9 cases of embezzlement by employees or elders or pastors of the churches. Right here, this presbytery, right now. So when Jamie sends that little sheet around that asks you to be counters, that's why. Because only when we have an appropriate system of checks and balances that makes sure that different people are handling the money and seeing what's going on, that's the only way you protect the flock from that kind of stuff that some people choose to do disfrazado de ovejas, in sheep's clothing. So it's not just an annoyance that Jamie happens to enjoy. She is protecting the flock. She is protecting the flock, and she needs you to help with that. Because I don't want us to become the next notch on somebody's embezzlement pistol, right? It is possible for people to appear like they're here to serve the flock, when their only real interest is to exploit the flock. So, Jesus cares not about what we think or believe anywhere near as much as he cares about how we live our lives. In seminary, we learn to use these two highfalutin words to talk about that. One that you're probably familiar with, orthodoxy. How many of you have heard that word before? Orthodoxy. It means right belief. Like when I was in college, to be a leader in one of the Christian groups, I had to sign a statement of belief. You know, they had to know I believed the right things before they would let me be a leader in that particular Christian group. I think Jesus is more concerned with what we came to call in seminary orthopraxis. How many of you heard of that word? Never, right? Okay, a couple of us. Orthopraxis is right doing, right acting, right living. And that's far greater a concern for Jesus than orthodoxy is. Jesus is quite unorthodox, even in what he does and says himself, given his context as a Jewish rabbi. But Jesus was far more concerned about doing the right thing. That's why he healed people on the Sabbath, even though that was not supposed to be done. Because if you believed in the Sabbath the way you were supposed to, you wouldn't do work on the Sabbath, even if it was healing somebody, right? And Jesus is like, forget that. This person needs healing, I'm going to heal him. I don't care if it's the Sabbath. I think this honors God more than not doing it honors God. And he goes on to use an agricultural metaphor to describe right action, orthopraxis. He says, you can tell whether someone, in particular a preacher or a teacher who comes into the community, is someone you should pay attention to, not by how pretty their words are, but what is the quality of the life that they're leading. Are they bearing fruit that is appropriate to being a follower of mine? Now, we could probably go into a whole list of what we think are the appropriate things. But I'd like to just circle back to last Sunday. Because honestly, if we are walking by, if we are living by that one simple rule, treat other people the way you want to be treated, then we're probably bearing the right kind of fruit. And if we're not, then we're probably not. In Jesus' final words with the disciples in John's gospel, he focuses on one thing. He says, love each other the way I have loved you. By this sign, by this action, by this way of life, you will demonstrate that you are of God and that God is in you. Love one another the way I have loved you. So you see, what Jesus really cares about for you and for me is how we treat our family. What he really cares about is how you treat your neighbors. What he really cares about is, do you pay your workers fairly? Do you treat your workers with dignity? Do you treat them with respect? Do you treat them the way you would like to be treated? I was excited that in San Antonio we're finally as a city saying, you know, people deserve to have paid time when they're sick, so that they don't feel like they've got to come to work sick so they can pay their bills and infect everybody else in the office, right? That's not a good thing. Teachers, you really understand the importance of that, right? What Jesus cares about is how we live our lives with each other. That's the fruit. The fruit of that love for one another is the fruit that he longs for us to offer the world. He cares more about what do we do with our money? What do we do with our things? Do we share with one another? Are we generous like God is generous with us? How do we care for the most vulnerable in our community? Do we pay any attention to them, or do we ignore them? How do we care about the immigrants and the strangers in our society? Do we welcome them? Do we seek to serve them? Do we care for the refugees who are seeking assistance? Or do we turn them away? Or do we decide we should shoot them in the legs when they cross, as was recently reported out of the lips of our president? Jesus cares about what we do far more than what you say with your mouth or think with your brain. Can we live in ways that honor his desire for us to love as we've been loved? Can we live in ways that demonstrate with each person that we are in relationship with, that we know how to treat them the way we ourselves would like to be treated? Because that is the fruit test. That determines whether our lives manifest clearly that we belong to Jesus or not. Let us pray. Lord, on this Sunday when we remember our communion with sisters and brothers across the planet, when we pray for unity despite the diversity of our practices and our doctrinal differences, when we take up offerings for the making of peace on this planet, give us hearts that long to do right, that long to embody in all of our actions the love that we have known in Jesus Christ, the love that we have known in your sovereign care, the love that has been poured out so generously upon each and every one of us. Let us be known for our love. Let us be known for our generosity. Let us be known for the dignity that we confer to everyone, so that people may know that we belong to you. For it is in your name we pray. Amen.
Ramiro, I think you're up for offertory today. Friends, grateful for all of the ways in which God has manifested grace and mercy in our lives. Let us present our lives and our Oh, in them, I'm so sorry.
Just want the money.
God has such a wonderful way of keeping me humble. Yeah, it would have been a shame to miss that. Grateful